You know the myth, right? Back in 1997, Apple was basically on its deathbed, and Bill Gates generously swooped in, wrote a $150 million check, and saved his bitter rival from total bankruptcy. Well, it's a great story, but the truth is actually a high-stakes corporate thriller. We're talking secret settlements, multi-billion-dollar lawsuits, and an absolutely brilliant display of leverage by Steve Jobs. In this explainer, we're going to tear down the myth and look right at the original documents that changed the entire trajectory of the modern world. Let's get into it.
To really grasp what happened, we got to set the scene. Just how bleak were things for Apple? Well, look at this quote. It perfectly captures the industry consensus back then. When Michael Dell, the founder of Dell Computers, was asked what he would do if he were running Apple in 1997, his response was just brutal. He said, "I'd shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders." Ouch. To the rest of the tech world, Apple wasn't just struggling. They were already a dead company walking.
And honestly, the numbers totally backed up that grim outlook. Over the previous 18 months, Apple had bled through a staggering $1 billion in losses. $1 billion. Their share of the personal computer market had plummeted to less than 5%. The situation was so incredibly dire that internal estimates showed the company had less than 90 days of cash left before they'd have to file for total bankruptcy.
So how did a giant like Apple even get there? Well, the mid-90s were just an era of absolute bloat and confusion for them. I mean, they were trying to sell 12 different versions of the Macintosh all at the same time, and they couldn't even clearly explain the differences between them to everyday consumers. Because of that, they had over $1 billion worth of unsold goods just sitting in stock. Add in some highly dysfunctional management and these far-fetched tech dreams that went absolutely nowhere, and boom, Apple recorded its biggest quarterly loss ever, a devastating $700 million in just the third quarter of 1996 alone.
Okay, so early 1997. In a truly desperate move to fix their software mess, then CEO Gil Amelio buys a company called Next for roughly $430 million. But what he really bought was the return of Apple's exiled co-founder, Steve Jobs. Now, Jobs initially came back just as an advisor, but he had zero faith in Amelio's leadership. In June, Jobs actually sold 1.5 million of his own Apple shares, which totally tanked the stock to a 12-year low. It forced the board's hand. Amelio is out, and by August, Jobs is named interim CEO. And his very first order of business? He picks up the phone and calls Bill Gates.
Section 1. The Macworld Shock. August 6, 1997.
That phone call culminated right here at the Macworld Expo in Boston. The atmosphere in that room was electric. This was Steve Jobs' first major public appearance as interim CEO, and the Apple faithful are hanging on to his every word, desperate for a sign that their beloved company was going to survive. But then, the unthinkable happens. Jobs announces a massive 5-year alliance with Microsoft. And as he's speaking, Bill Gates appears via satellite, towering like a giant Big Brother figure on the massive presentation screen behind Jobs. The audience was horrified. They literally erupted into loud boos. To Apple loyalists, Microsoft was the ultimate enemy. Even Jobs himself later called this projection the worst and stupidest staging mistake of his life.
So let's break down what the public actually saw that day. The headlines were screening about a $150 million investment from Microsoft into Apple stock, but that was really just one piece. Microsoft also committed to making Microsoft Office for the Mac for 5 years. In exchange, Apple agreed to make Internet Explorer the default browser on Mac computers. They agreed to collaborate on Java, and they agreed to cross-license their patents and drop their existing lawsuits against each other. On paper, it sounded exactly like a massive corporate bailout. But in this explainer, we don't just stop at the headlines. We're going to look at the actual paperwork. And this brilliantly illustrates what was really going on behind the scenes. This right here is the cover page of the 1997 Technology Agreement. And let me tell you, this was no friendly handshake between old rivals. It was a rigorous, highly calculated strategic treaty where both sides basically had a gun to the other's head.
Just look at Section 2 of the document, the commitment to Microsoft Office for Macintosh. Back in 1995, Office for Mac accounted for over 32% of Apple's home market revenue. Without Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, Apple simply couldn't serve business or education customers. It was an absolute existential requirement for Apple's survival. Microsoft knew this too. An internal Microsoft email even pointed out that threatening to cancel Mac Office was literally the strongest bargaining chip they had.
Then we move to Section 3, the Internet Explorer Clause. Microsoft was in a bitter, nasty browser war with Netscape at the time. By forcing Apple to make Internet Explorer the default browser on all new Macs, Microsoft aggressively expanded its footprint. But put a pin in this clause, all right? Because this aggressive little play is going to become a massive legal liability for Bill Gates very soon.
Now here is where the true leverage of Steve Jobs starts to reveal itself. Section 5, termination and release. This buried legal section fundamentally changed everything. It completely wiped out a massive decade-long look and feel copyright lawsuit where Apple claimed Microsoft basically stole the graphical user interface for Windows. Jobs agreed to drop the suits, saving Microsoft from years of legal uncertainty and potentially billions of dollars in damages. Finally, we've got Section 6, locking down a 5-year term for these agreements. What that did was effectively guarantee a 5-year runway for Apple to rebuild without Microsoft breathing down their necks. It locked in a critical period of mutually assured survival for both tech giants.
Which brings us to the most important question of this whole explainer. Was $150 million really enough to save Apple? Remember, all the headlines said Bill Gates' $150 million check saved the company. But here's the kicker. Apple actually had $1.2 billion in cash on hand at the time. For a company burning through that much capital, a $150 million non-voting stock purchase is basically pocket change. It was a total smokescreen.
So here's the real meat of the deal. Behind closed doors, Microsoft paid Apple a secret, completely undisclosed settlement. Why? Because Apple had a very strong claim that Intel and Microsoft's had literally stolen the code for Apple's QuickTime multimedia technology to build video into Windows. Industry estimates place this secret payout anywhere between $500 million to a staggering $2 billion over several years. That is what actually funded Apple's recovery.
So the crucial takeaway here is that Steve Jobs negotiated from a position of massive leverage, despite his company being 90 days from death. He had 3 main weapons: the QuickTime Code lawsuit, the GUI copyright lawsuit, and most importantly, the United States Department of Justice. See, in 1997, Microsoft controlled 95% of the desktop operating system market. If Apple went bankrupt, Microsoft becomes a total monopoly, and the US government would step in and break them up. Microsoft desperately needed Apple to stay alive.
When you compare what they actually walked away with, it's just fascinating. Microsoft bought themselves a defense against the DOJ by keeping their only real competitor breathing, while also protecting their highly profitable Office revenue. Apple, on the other hand, bought exactly what they needed: secret cash to fund development, crucial software to keep their customers, and the public confidence that gave Steve Jobs the breathing room to totally reinvent the company.
Section 2, the ultimate irony and a $1 trillion legacy.
Because there is an ultimate irony to this whole story in the aftermath. Microsoft made this deal largely to avoid being sued by the government for being an anti-competitive monopoly. Yet just 1 year later, the DOJ sued Microsoft for antitrust anyway. And one of the core pieces of evidence they used against them, that very clause we looked at earlier, forcing Apple to make Internet Explorer the default browser, Microsoft's defensive move became the weapon used against them. Meanwhile, Apple used this incredible lifeline to orchestrate literally the greatest turnaround in business history. Immediately after the deal, the stock jumped 35%. The next year, in 1998, Jobs launches the colorful iMac, selling 800,000 units in just 5 months. By surviving the 90s desktop wars, Apple was perfectly positioned to pivot. They launched the iPod in 2001 and then the iPhone in 2007, completely dominating the mobile computing market, a market that Microsoft entirely missed.
Just look at this astonishing reversal of fortune. In 1997, Apple was worth barely $5 billion. Today, it sits at a staggering $3.5 trillion. Microsoft, who by the way ended up selling their Apple stock in 2003 for what now looks like absolute pennies, is worth around $3.1 trillion. The underdog that Microsoft kept alive on life support eventually surpassed them to become the most valuable company in the entire world.
So what you should really take away from this is how one perfectly timed, highly leveraged negotiation can alter human history. What if this deal never happened? Imagine a world today with no iPhones, no MacBooks, no Apple Watch. Imagine a Microsoft that might have been forcefully broken into separate companies by the US government. It's a radically different tech landscape, and it all hinges on one incredibly tense negotiation in August of 1997. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll leave you to think about that alternate reality until next time.